This video is brought to you by the sharpening jig. This is a jig of my own design. It's for sale on my website. It's a great jig for sharpening chisels and plane blades, and it's the fastest method for those mid-project touch-up sharpenings. For more information, I have a video on my channel and links in all of the normal places. I set out to make this box for my daughter, and I ended up making two, which was a mistake. More on that later. My little lady turned 6 and has shown some interest in jewelry and trinkets and stuff and junk. She asked for a box, and I thought I'd give it a go. In setting some goals for this project, I boiled it down to 3 basic things. 1, it needs to hold stuff. 2, it must be made from materials I have laying around. And 3, it needs to be quick and simple. Given my daughter's age, there's a high probability that this thing will get demolished. So I'll leave the ebony and hand-cut joinery for a box when she's older. Find a few chunks of mahogany laying around, and I start making some box parts. And here I'm just showing how I cut the pieces to create a box where the grain wraps around the outside. I cut my 2 chunks into a short piece and a long piece. I don't really have a better way to explain this, but on one, the left is the short piece and the right is the long piece. On the other, the right is the short piece and the left is the long piece. You can see how I'm laying it out here. So I made a newbie mistake. I forgot to remove the bandsaw surface before cutting to length. Now the parts are too small to go through the planer. So here's my solution. My view on mistakes, which has been beaten into me repeatedly over many moons, is they're pretty much like a controlled burn. You just got to keep them under control and try not to burn down any structures. But most importantly, don't get wrapped around the axle. There's always a solution. At this point, the parts are almost cut to size. I felt like the box was going to be a little too tall, so I cut it down a little. I'm planning for mitered corners, and I needed to make a jig for my shooting board to allow me to hand plane those joints. Cut a few pieces of plywood with some 45-degree miters. I drilled a couple holes in them, and I glued them into a big old chunk. Probably could have cut these parts more consistently, which would have made for a more attractive jig. Overall, this method worked great. 5 stars, would recommend. After my chunk was dry, I removed the bolts and screwed a stop fence on. I didn't clamp this with the bolts originally because it would have made aligning all the other pieces more difficult. Now the fun begins. I have 4 pieces, 2 pairs, that are cut to exact length. I use my newly formed jig in conjunction with my shooting board to make some miters. The key is to take passes until a sharp point is formed and then take no more. I do this with 2 plane settings. On the first one, I'm taking a pretty big cut. The second one is a whisper fine shaving. This allows me to sneak up on my edge and not go too far. Both the bottom and top will be secured with this joint. I'm using a 1/8 inch blade, so each kerf is cut 1/8 inch from the edge. Does that make sense? I don't know. The sides are cut with the part flat, and the top and bottom are cut vertical. This is a neat joint. It uses the same setup for both parts, just changed the orientation. Normally, the foreman will walk around and ask questions with a cup of coffee in hand. In this case, with oversized pink sweater donned, I was informed that the color was pretty, but it's probably not big enough for all the jewelry she wants. This may seem wacky, and maybe it is, but I like to clean parts up with a hand plane, which is fast when your tools are as sharp as mine, thanks to my sharpening jig. Check my website. This keeps parts very flat and consistent. Then I hit them with some fine sandpaper. I do this to give the finish some tooth to grab onto. I hit the insides with some poly, which makes cleaning any squeeze out later super easy. I've done this a million times, and yet I'm always surprised how awesome blue painter's tape is at clamping up miters. One thing I will say when gluing miters, I think it's important to spread the glue out twice. Get some glue on there, spread it around, let the end grain soak it up, and then do that all over again. This will prevent the greedy, thirsty end grain from starving the joint of glue. Once the box has been rolled up and taped shut, put it in the oven at 425 for 10 minutes. I don't know what that means. Once dry, it's over to the table saw to cut the lid off. I make the first 3 cuts as one would expect. The 4th cut makes me look like an L7 weenie, but I have the lid taped with a stick in the kerf, not for safety. Tough guys like me don't care about safety, but actually to get a better cut quality. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I ended up making 2 boxes and that it was a mistake. Well, here's the deal. I'm actually so cheap I can't throw away my test pieces. So when making a project, I always make some test or setup pieces. I normally use uglier pieces for this, as one would. In this case, all my test pieces kind of ended up being usable. So I said to myself, let's make a second box. Then it's like 2 for 1, right? Since I didn't have a second set of hinges, I decided to add this mitered liner that would hold the lid in place. So now I'm way off in left field, just out there picking daisies. I'm doing something I had no intention of doing, and in no way does this help me complete my project.
Okay, so it goes on, but it's tough.
I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I did a pretty darn good job of fitting all these pieces. And this is a neat way to create a box if you don't have hinges. The real problem is, at this point, I'm making 2 different projects. So the lesson here is go ahead and make 2 of something. It is more efficient, but make them exactly the same so you can gain those efficiencies. Don't do as I have done and make 2 different projects. Okay, let's get back on track. I wanted to make some trays to help with organization. So I started by resawing some stock to just over the thickness of 1 table saw kerf. Couple of passes through the wide belt to bring them down to exactly the thickness of a saw kerf. What's with all this talk of saw kerf thickness? Well, here's the reason. I'm going to use half laps created by, you guessed it, the kerf of my table saw blade. And by the way, you have to take a drink every time I say kerf. So, kerf. If you look carefully at this shot, the saw blade is wobbling a little. I think the plate is bent on this blade. It ends up cutting about 135 thou kerf. Oh, there's that word again. I used the old number 4 to help fit a couple of the lap joints. After that, I glued the grids to the bottoms. I just put a little glue on the bottom of the grid, and I set it on top of the bottom and put a hand plate on top of it. Hopefully that's enough clamping pressure. After that, it was time for some fitting. Next up, fitting hinges. This is a task that really separates the pro woodworkers from the tools. I start by purchasing good quality hinges. In this case, I had these laying around, but high quality they are. Next, I use a marking gauge to mark the outside edge and also the depth of the hinge, which in this case I'm doing incorrectly. I have a straight bit chucked up in the router and I'm just removing material down to my incorrectly marked line. I use a super sharp chisel sharpened on the sharpening jig to pair right up to my line. How I mark that line, you ask? I like to set the hinge in place and use a marking knife to set that total width. Pro tip, put the marking knife down into the mark, then press the square up against the marking knife. Way more accurate than the other way around.
Okay, so how did we do on width?
I don't know, Mike, how did we do?
That is a perfectly fitting hinge.
Maybe I didn't drink enough coffee this particular morning, but the hinge leaf is like 100 thou thick, but there's a gap between the leaves when the hinges close. So the second go around, I go to the proper depth of about 145 thou deep, which nets me a nicely fitting hinge all the way around. I use a Vicks bit and a little block clamped in place to make sure I get the holes drilled just right. Time to break out the A game. I only get one shot at this cut. I'm making a little mortise for the handle. The little strip of wood that I have was just a smidge too thick. This is one of those situations where there is nothing better for the task than a sharp hand plane. And don't worry, I won't mention my sharpening jig again. And I finish it off with some wipe-on poly. When I started taking the beautiful finished shots you see here, I realized I made another newbie mistake. I used clear wax as a finishing polish. The problem with this is it falls into the pores and the wood looks a little dry. The fix is an easy pro tip. On darker woods, use a tinted paste wax as your finisher. I like to apply with 4/0 steel wool. The B box turned out fine. Probably wasn't worth the extra time though. The A box turned out great. I rounded the handle a little bit, which looks nice. The trays fit well enough for a 6-year-old and should provide plenty of storage for a few years anyway. Mahogany is a great wood. It's almost hard to make an ugly project when using it. This is me showing off the lovely chatoyance mahogany has. Anyway, thank you for watching. Till next time, Kerf.